All right, welcome to our first lesson for chapter 14. So we're moving on from chapter 13, which was covering soil, into chapter 14, which talks about agriculture. So for this first lesson, we're just going to do a quick introduction to agriculture and a few different types. So learning goal or learning objective here is that you will be able to compare and describe various types of agriculture and the related concerns. So learning goals for this lesson, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe shifting agriculture, describe situations that require labor-intensive farming practices, explain how mechanization encouraged monoculture farming, list the advantages and disadvantages of monoculture farming, explain why chemical fertilizers are used, describe the difference between macronutrients and micronutrients, and then explain why soil organic matter is important. So a few things we will go over in this lesson. So let's start with the development of agriculture. So development of agriculture involved manipulating the natural environment to produce food desired by humans. This allowed an increase in the size of the human population because before agriculture, we were hunters and gatherers for the most part. So we had to go and find our food. With agriculture, we were able to set it up so that we grew the food, we knew that we were going to have food there, and we could kind of stay and grow in like towns and villages and things like that. And we kind of artificially increased the food supply that human beings had with agriculture. So one type of agriculture that you may not have heard of because it's not common in the US, really doesn't happen in the US, is shifting agriculture. And this involves cutting down and burning the trees and other vegetation in a small area of the forest. This burning releases nutrients that are bound up in biomass, or burning the little bit of plant life that's left so that releases that biomass back into the soil. And the cleared soil is then useful for 2 to 3 years. The forest then eventually recolonizes the area, and this is particularly useful on thin tropical soils. It's not suitable for large, densely populated areas, and it requires a long recovery time between cycles. That's why it's called shifting agriculture, because you're shifting from this section and then you're going to go to this section and then shifting to this section, because that section that you cut down and burn is only good for a couple of years. So shifting agriculture often employs polyculture, which is not common in the US, but polyculture is the planting of a mixture of plants. Labor-intensive agriculture is practiced in much of the world, meaning like it takes a lot of labor, it takes a lot of work. There's 3 situations that favor this type of agriculture. That the growing site does not allow for mechanization, meaning like plows and all of the machinery that are used on like what we see in US agricultural land. The crop does not allow for mechanization, or the economic condition does not allow purchase. So like just economically they can't afford it. So these are examples of labor-intensive agriculture. So these are rice paddies. The primary reason for the use of labor-intensive agriculture is economic. Many densely populated countries have numerous small farms that can be effectively managed with human labor. So sometimes it's not needed because of how that community is set up. If there's a lot of small farms, then we don't need these machines to work huge areas of land like we do in the US. So mechanized monoculture agriculture. Mechanized monoculture agriculture, which is, what a mouthful, is typical of industrialized countries. So this is what we see in the US. It's fossil fuel replacing human muscle power. So what previously was humans pulling those crops out or harvesting the crops, it's now machines doing it. This method requires large amounts of energy and flat land. It needs to be flat, so those they're basically vehicles, but so those machines can drive over the land. Monocultures mean there is one, mono meaning one, thing being grown, promotes a more efficient planting, cultivating, and harvesting. And farmers often rely on hybrids to provide uniform monocultures. So all of the crop planted there are basically clones of themselves. They're all the same, which makes harvesting easier. So with labor reduction in the US, we can see that in 1913, it took 135 hours of labor to produce 2,500 kilograms of corn. So that was human labor producing that corn. In 1980, that was only 15 hours of labor because instead of, it being human powered, it is vehicle powered. And it takes 5 metric tons of fossil fuel to produce 1 metric ton of fertilizer. And the developed world is dependent on oil to produce energy to manufacture pesticides and fertilizer and to run machines. So oil is required for all of these things. The price of oil has wide ramifications on the world's ability to feed itself. So the price of oil has huge impact on the price of our food because it's required for so many steps in the development and growth of our food and harvesting of our food. So that sounds great with monoculture. It's easy to harvest. It's all of the things are easy. The problem is large tracts of bare land increases soil erosion. So if we have filled up this whole land with one crop and then we harvest it all and we leave it bare, we just learned that bare soil in our last chapter means that we're going to lose that soil. And then also the planting of genetically identical seeds results in a loss of genetic diversity. If an illness, disease was to come through those plants, because they're all the same, they're all going to die. Little genetic differentiation often leads to increased pesticide use. We'll talk about pesticide use, especially with GMOs, later on. No crop rotation depletes soil nutrients and increases fertilizer use. So some plants are really good at helping the soil get more nutrients, but most crops that we grow take those nutrients. So if you're constantly growing corn on the same land, it's just taking and taking nutrients. No nutrients are going back in, which means we have to artificially add them, which means fertilizers. And fertilizers can lead to a lot of different issues. Fossil fuel energy has replaced human muscle power, which is good in that we can produce more food with less energy, but that also means we're using more and more fossil fuels, which is its own issue. So for fertilizer and agriculture, approximately 25% of the world's agricultural crop is directly attributed to chemical fertilizer use. So 25% of all the food in the world uses chemical fertilizer. Fertilizers replace soil nutrients that are extracted by plants, and the price and availability of chemical fertilizers are strongly influenced by the world's energy prices. So when we look at those nutrients that plants need, the three primary soil nutrients are called macronutrients, and those are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Plants need these in large amounts. Micronutrients, also really necessary, but they don't need as much of them, are boron, zinc, and manganese. So for fertilizer and agriculture continued, chemical fertilizers do not replace soil organic matter, which is important for soil structure. We just talked about how soil is formed. Organic matter is a huge part of that. Organic matter is usually what gives nutrients in to the soil, which we're not getting on monocultural farms. We get that from fertilizer. So we're not getting that organic matter, which affects that soil structure. And total dependency on chemical fertilizers usually reduces the amount of organic matter that can change the physical, chemical, and biological properties of the soil. So we can see over time in every circumstance that chemical fertilizer use has increased everywhere. Less so in developed countries because it was already widely in use in the 80s and 90s. So we're just using a little bit more. But over the world total, it's increased over time. So take a look at these questions. See if after that lesson, can you answer these questions? You do not need the right answers down right now, but I will ask you later. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next one.